We appreciate you guys joining us today. I'll start with just a quick round of introductions and then we'll jump right in. Um, my name is Scott Derby. I am the principal cloud strategist here at Planet Technologies. I lead our cloud strategist team, and we're here to help customers align the business and the technologies aspects when working with Planet around solutions. We're there to be your trusted advisor as you're helping to evaluate Microsoft technologies as you go about aspects from a transformational perspective. So with me, I have AJ joining us. AJ is our managing architect for our compliance team. So AJ Rogers, if you would introduce yourself quickly, and then we'll jump into the presentation.
For sure, yeah. My name's AJ Rogers. I'm the managing architect. Basically, Scott captured that beautifully. I head the compliance team for a lot of different compliance initiatives to include CJIS. So I'm happy to be here and share some knowledge and field some questions from y'all.
So we're going to jump right in. Our goal and our agenda today is really making sure that customers understand some of the new changes that has come through CJIS 6.0. As many of you probably are aware of, the FBI APB recently announced earlier this year a new version, a major version change from what was 5.9.5 from the CJIS Security Policy to now the new CJIS Security Policy 6.0. And it does do some substantive changes to really how customers are going to have to be aligning to the various security controls within the CJIS standards. It does bring about some changes to how audits and how assessments will be happening within that environment. And there's some key timelines to understand that many aren't necessarily aware of. And so we wanted to take the opportunity to help customers understand what those impacts may look like, what are some of the processes to help get compliant and be ready when your next CJIS security audit comes, and what are some of the things that need to be prepared within your environments to making sure that you can still remain compliant and you're still able to work with the critical data that you'll be exchanging with other law enforcement agencies as part of CJIS. So with that here, we're going to jump right in. So just to give you a high level of perspective around the agenda today, we're going to start with just introductions here, tell you a little bit around Planet Technologies, who we are, and how do we help support state, local, federal customers and law enforcement customers around managing CJIS data within their environments. From that perspective, then I'm going to let AJ take over and really talk about what are some of the key changes within CJIS 6.0 and why does it matter? We'll talk a little bit some of the considerations that you need to be having when you're working in the cloud with CJIS, whether you need to be looking at a commercial environment versus a FedRAMP authorized environments, what the impacts of that shared responsibility model mean for you, and how do you leverage a cloud service provider to help you make the most of that. We'll talk about some of the common use cases and some of the big things that you're going to have to look at when you're pivoting from where you were looking at compliance with 5.9.5 to now what that means as we move into 6.0. And then we're going to share a little bit around Planet's approach to CJIS and how some areas that we can help customers making sure that you're getting aligned to what CJIS can mean for you and how does that align to the technologies, capabilities that you may have today, and where does that align with the Microsoft stack to be able to help bring that compliance for you. And then lastly, we'll close out with some FAQs and some Q&A. Quick bit of housekeeping at the end. We will make it available that if you want to ask questions, you may. We would encourage you though too, if you do have questions, feel free to post them in the chat. One of us will be monitoring the chat and we'll make sure to bring them up as we go along. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump right in. I'll talk a little bit around Planet Technologies. So for those of you who are not familiar with Planet Technologies, we have been working across the Microsoft ecosystem for the past 27 years. We are a 27-time Partner of the Year award winner with Microsoft, where we have teams that have over 14 different advanced specializations. We have been focusing and working within the public sector our entire lives here at Planet. whether or not it is a dedicated teams that work across our federal government, including the FBI as one of our customers, as well as other customers, as well as we then work across state and local governments across the country to be able to help support them on all aspects of their Microsoft needs. And we bring teams that have a deep level of expertise around artificial intelligence, IT modernization, digital transformation, cloud computing, security and compliance, and learning adoption. So our goal is to make sure that you are really taking the most advantage of all the capabilities that you have through Microsoft. We want to make sure that we're there to help you leverage them and really make the most of the investments that you've made in many of the Microsoft technologies. So as we think specifically around how does this align to CJIS and compliance, this is a little bit different world, and this is different than, while there's a lot of managed services providers out there, few have the ability to be able to work in some of these really compliant environments such as CJIS. And our team here at Planet really brings a deep expertise around that area. We have a deep relationship with Microsoft. We were first to market on many environments inside of both GCC Moderate and GCC High with deep specialization in FedRAMP compliance. We have a deep specialization within CMMC compliance and CJIS, which, as many of you probably know, all those are really core based on the NIST standards, whether it's NIST 853 or NIST 800-171. So we have a deep blend and bench of teams that are crossing both the technical aspects to being able to look at the technologies and how to build out these environments and aligning to those control sets, or whether it's teams like AJ leads, which really can help you look at the compliance side of that one to making sure that you can prove that your environments can stand up to that test and be ready to that so that you can operate with, the utmost faith to know that everything is going to be safe and secured and it's well vetted and protected and ready to be audited when necessary. So when we look at this, our focus really does focus around two different sides of this. There's two pillars to how we approach from a compliance expertise perspective. First is leading with that technology. So we have a team of experts that have a deep level of expertise around core environments inside of Microsoft 365, whether or not we're talking about Microsoft 365 sitting in the GCC cloud, customers that are in GCC High, as well as customers that need to be working inside of Azure Government. We understand what the feature differences, the capability differences is, how the compliance side of that works. And we have been working in those environments, quite honestly, since their inception, to be able to making sure that as you're working with them, we can help you design the technical controls that can help you meet the compliance requirements that's necessary from CJIS and, quite honestly, other compliance requirements as well. But we know it doesn't stop at just the technical aspect. That's where AJ's team becomes a critical part of what we do when we're from an engagement perspective, where our team can help you lead the overall documentation of that. Whether that means that you need help developing that system security plan for your CJIS environment in order to be able to have those artifacts to be ready when your audit comes time. Whether or not it's helping draft your CJIS security addenda. Do you have to document your data flow diagrams, or do you need your policy libraries mapped to the CJIS control family? All those are areas where our team brings an in-depth level of expertise to be able to help you do that so that we can help you reduce some of that burden. And you can have the faith to know that, hey, we're prepared when it comes time to be able to go through that audit. So we're here to whether or not you're starting from zero, or if you have a really matured environment, we can help organizations, quite honestly, at all levels. So with that, I'm going to dive into what does this mean? Who must comply from a CJIS 6.0? And quite honestly, many of this hasn't changed. this is still going to focus at any organization that needs to be exchanging CGI data or criminal justice information data or connecting with FBI or other federal law enforcement agencies or connecting with state law enforcement agencies to be able to share and exchange those data sets. How the mediums and how you do that are all quite honestly within the scope, and those need to be considered as you're going through this. So one of the things that I would like anyone who is a federal, state, local, tribal, or even campus police really need to be concerned about what does this mean for them and how are they prepared for that. It doesn't just stand at law enforcement, whether it's police agencies. It also means any of the agencies that are handling this data as well, whether or not it's the courts, corrections, or prosecutors, are all applicable, are all part of the boundary that needs to be considered. This can also be non-criminal justice agencies too. So any organization that has an authorization level or access into there to be able to exchange that data falls under meeting a CJIS standard from that perspective. That can also be extended to private contractors, vendors, whether or not it's a managed service provider or another cloud service provider that's helping you support these environments, or and all the way down to even mobile and remote users, whether or not they're officers, investigators, analysts. Anyone who's looking at this data is really subject to this, and it means that we really need to take a close look at our environment, and in some cases segment our environment versus other parts of our environment who are not necessarily doing this so that we can remain in complete compliance. So I want to talk a little bit around some of the high level changes here. We've seen some core changes that are at multi-factor authentication. We've seen some core changes with encryption standards and how they're handling with FIPS 140-2. There's also been some expansion around personnel screening, cloud provider management, and incident response. And I'm going to turn it over to AJ here to kind of talk a little bit more in depth where he can share some specific areas to what we've seen. What are things you want to watch for, and how do you get prepared for that? So, AJ?
Thanks, Scott. So if we get into the substance of what actually changed between version 5.9.5 and version 6, this is obviously not a comprehensive list of changes, but these are 5 control areas where we're seeing the most operational impact for our customers. So starting at the top, multi-factor authentication. Obviously, it's not new. This is not a new requirement in version 6.0. The MFA mandate actually arrived a number of years back in December 22, I believe, when Section 5.6 was modernized with the NIST-based identification and authentication control family. And it became sanctionable as of October of 2024. So if you were compliant with 5.9.5, you already have MFA on every account accessing CJI. However, what version 6 does is sort of finish the modernization. It fully aligns authentication with the authentication management control, which is IA5, and is now a priority 1 control requiring immediate implementation. So password standards shift from old complexity rules to length and quality checks with banned password screenings. Phishing resistant MFA becomes the expectation in certain contexts and not just any second factor. So really the practical question for your roadmap isn't do we have MFA, it's do our authenticators meet the new standard? And if your officers and analysts are still relying on SMS codes as their second factor, then that's probably the gap to put on the roadmap today. And we've rated this a high impact because authentication modernization touches every user, and the lift from legacy MFA to phishing resistant methods is real. On the second row, encryption standards, the headline here is that version 6.0 now accepts FIPS 140-3 validated modules alongside 140-2. And that sounds like good news, and it is, but the fine print matters. And the date to really write down here is September 21st, 2026. And this is actually when FIPS 140-2 validations move to the NIST historical list. So existing systems can continue on with 140-2, but new procurement should be specifying 140-3 certificates. Um, your ability to rotate current standards as older ones sunset is really going to sort of highlight your agility in you know compensating for those changes. Practically speaking, you need to know exactly where your cryptographic modules are, what validation certificates that they carry, and then who owns your key lifecycle. And if the answer to any of those is, well, I'd have to check, then that's probably your starting point. So for personnel screening, this one we've rated at medium, but I wouldn't let that fool you into deprioritizing it. So version 6.0 expands the screening requirement, and this is the part that I really want to emphasize here, is it explicitly ties security awareness training to role-based access. So it's no longer enough to run everyone through that same exact annual training module. Someone with privileged access to CJI systems needs training commensurate with that role. Your training program and your access model now sort of need to talk to each other. That fourth one, cloud provider management. So version 6.0 strengthens CSP oversight pretty significantly, and it makes the CJIS security addendum a formal requirement for all contracts touching CJI. If you got cloud vendors in your environment operating on a handshake and a generic terms of service, then you probably have some contractual remediation work to do. We'll spend a section on cloud considerations here in just a few minutes, so we'll just hold that thought right there. But lastly, incident response. So reporting obligations existed under 595, but version 6 gets a little bit more prescriptive. There are tighter notification timelines, more specific requirements about what gets reported into whom, and a mandate that your IR plan gets tested annually. So this could be a tabletop exercise, a simulation, something that proves that the plan works when people are actually following it under pressure. And I think if you sort of look at all of those rows in its totality, the thing to take away is that version 6.0 takes things that were implied, recommended, or loosely defined in version 595 and makes them more explicit, mandatory, verifiable. And I think that's the whole theme of this release. So if we can go on to that next one. Okay, so every requirement in version 6.0 has been categorized into priority levels, and controls identified as existing, meaning they were carried over from the prior policy, and then anything tagged as priority 1 must be implemented now. There's really no runway on those. They are immediately sanctionable. And as you can see on the slide, that's 181 controls in that are immediately sanctionable in that bucket. Then you have the phased tiers, and this is what's referred to as the zero cycle priorities. So priority 2 is 104 controls, priority 3 is 37, and then priority 4 is 13. And those must all be implemented by October 1st, 2027. And so if you add all of that up, you're looking at about 335 sanctionable controls by that date. So let me kind of translate what this means operationally. The FBI is giving agencies a structured glide path, and they're acknowledging that nobody really flips 335 controls overnight, but they're also kind of drawing a very clear line here that the existing and priority 1 controls are table stakes today, and that the 2027 deadline for everything else is not a suggestion. So I want to be clear, sanctionable means exactly what it sounds like. Failure to implement can result in sanctions up to and including loss of CJIS systems. And so for a law enforcement agency, losing NCIC access isn't really just an IT problem. It can become a operational crisis, as you can imagine. So what we're helping customers do right now is to sort of treat that 2027 date not as a deadline to race toward, but as an endpoint of a planned and phased program. And that's actually a perfect segue because on the next slide, I'm going to lay out what phasing for this can sort of look like. Scott, if you don't mind. Okay, so here's the good news sort of buried in that priority system. While the policy says everything must be done by October 1st, 2027, agencies are going to have flexibility on when they can implement the P2 through P4 controls inside that window. The FBI is really just telling you what and by when, but the how and in what order is sort of yours to design. So this slide is just our recommended four-phase approach, and I'm just going to quickly walk you through each of those phases. So the very first one, phase one, Q3 of 2026, that's right now, right? This is your foundational quarter, and it's entirely about planning and not really about implementation. You conduct your initial P2 through P4 gap assessment against the version 6 policy. You identify your scope, which systems are impacted, which vendors are in play, who your internal stakeholders are. You're basically building a governance model and assigning control owners. And I want to stress that piece because controls without named owners, they don't get implemented, they get discussed. So you develop your preliminary budget and procurement plans because some of this work will require funding cycles and contract vehicles is going to take some time. And you map your dependencies. So supply chain risk management, personnel security, authenticator modernization work. And so that will give you an idea of what has to happen before what other things. And the outcome of phase one is a clear board-approved implementation plan. And if you leave this phase with leadership sign-off and a funded roadmap, you've already sort of de-risked your entire program. In phase two, this is process infrastructure. So before you touch a single technical configuration, you're standing up the organizational machinery. So your supply chain risk management plan, your personnel security, assessment and authorization, getting all of those things sort of in focus, and then beginning your incremental authenticator work. So like building a banned password list and policy alignment that don't really require heavy technical change just yet. The reason process comes before technology is when you change a system configuration without the surrounding process, the configuration drifts back, and process is really what makes technical change sticks. Phase three, this is going to be the heavy lift technical phase. And notice it gets the longest runway. You update your system and services, acquisition workflows, you're implementing enhanced monitoring instrumentation, you're aligning every external service provider with the revised expectation. So this is notification agreements, supply chain controls, the works. You harden system configurations and enforce monitoring baselines, and you do the authenticator requirements that demand real technical change. So this could be directory service policies, credential verification enhancements. The outcome here is that the majority of your material technical controls are complete well before the deadline, so not in a panic sprint during the summer of 2027. Lastly, phase four. So this is really just about validation, right? You're running checks against all the P2 through P4 requirements. Maybe you conduct a mock audit. And this is something Planet does extensively for our customers to test not just whether the controls exist, but whether evidence is available and traceable. Because in an audit, a control that you can't evidence is a control that, for all intents and purposes, you don't have. You close out your POAMs, fully activate continuous monitoring, and you make sure your vendors have documented proof of alignment. And then the outcome of this is that you're walking into October 1st, 2027, audit ready with everything done by September 30th. Let's go ahead and go to that next one, Scott. So I want to talk about how compliance actually gets validated because version 6.0 puts real emphasis on independent verification, and there's some important context sort of at the bottom of this slide that I want to start with. So under version 5.9.5 and really all the other prior policies, implementations across the states were let's just say inconsistent. The same control might be interpreted 3 different ways in 3 different states, and then validation rigor varied wildly. That inconsistency is precisely why the federal government has moved to establish a standard for how states validate that controls have actually been implemented. So version 6.0, it's not just about changing the controls, it's changing how anyone checks the work. So what does that validation look like in practice? I have 4 sort of mechanisms on this slide. So the primary one obviously is going to be the CJIS security audit that's conducted by your state's CJIS systems agency, the CSA, or their authorized auditor. And note that the audit surface itself grew with version 6.0. So the policy restructured from the legacy 13 policy areas to the 20 distinct policy areas that are aligned to the NIST 853 controls. And if your last audit was under the 13 area model, expect the next one to cover meaningfully more ground. And this is the audit that matters. Everything else on this slide is supporting evidence. The CJIS security, the state CSA audit, that is really the exam. You've got sort of two proxy mechanisms that matter for vendors and cloud providers. So the ISO 27001 and 27701, these are, internationally recognized certifications for information security. They don't replace a CJIS audit, but they provide strong proxy evidence that a vendor's control environment is mature. And this is really the same story as a SOC 2 type 2, where it's a trust services criteria audit covering security, availability, and confidentiality over a sustained observation period. So when you're vetting a CSP or a SaaS vendor that will touch CJI, these are the artifacts that you should be requesting for. And then finally, for cloud deployment specifically, FedRAMP authorization. So a FedRAMP moderate or high authorization represents a very rigorous government-validated security baseline. And it does significant heavy lifting towards CJIS compliance for the infrastructure layer. I do want to highlight that it's not automatic compliance, and we'll come back to that distinction here in just a sec, but it's the strongest cloud-specific signal available. And so the takeaway for your vendor management program here is that you need to sort of build a tiered evidence expectation. Your CSA audit validates you, and these certifications and authorizations validate the people that you depend on. Let's go to slide 11. Okay. So this brings us to the cloud considerations, and this is probably the most common questions that we get from agency is, can we just run this in our existing commercial cloud tenant? And the answer to that is going to be an unsatisfying answer, but it's sort of complicated, right? At least it is for CJI workloads, and here's why. So if you start with the left column, the commercial public cloud, first, it's multi-tenant infrastructure shared with commercial customers worldwide. Second, and this is frequently a disqualifying issue, is that data sovereignty is not guaranteed. So your data may reside or be processed outside of US jurisdiction. And CJIS often has firm expectations about where CJI lives. I say often because it is largely sort of deferred to the individual state. We'll get to that here in just a sec. But third, Microsoft's commercial environments, they don't actually meet CJIS personnel screening requirements. And this is an important distinction because agencies end up forced to sort of manage their own encryption keys to sort of compensate. And this can add operational burden and risk that most agencies aren't really staffed for. The CJIS Security Addendum, the legally binding agreement that we sort of mentioned earlier, it's harder to enforce contractually in the commercial framework. And so if you stack all that up, the conclusion sort of writes itself, that commercial cloud is not recommended for CGI workloads. Now let's move over to the FedRAMP version of that on the right. So GCC moderate to high and Azure government essentially guarantees data residency within the United States by architecture, and it's not just by promise. So an isolated government cloud where the personnel operating the platform are background screened. And so this directly addresses the CJIS personnel requirements that commercial can't meet. FIPS 140-2 and 140-3 validated encryption is enforced by default. It's not really an opt-in configuration. FedRAMP moderate and high authorization also gives you a documented government validated control baseline that you can point to in your system security plan. And then the CJIS security addendum is executed as part of the contractual framework. It's actually built into how Microsoft does business in these environments.
One thing I'll add in there too, AJ, is that it's important to note that Microsoft will do that with a single adjudicating authority within the state. So it's typically maybe, your state police, highway patrol, whomever that level is within your state, they do that, and then they recognize that as that adjudicating authority, and then that extends to all of the local law enforcement agencies within that state. So today, Microsoft has signed this. I believe right now it's at 48 states. So most every state in the country has a signed CJIS addendum with Microsoft, and that covers most law enforcement organizations within the state.
That's a great point. Okay, I think that's good for me on this one. Let's move to the next one. Okay, so you are in the FedRAMP cloud. Does this mean that Microsoft handles your CJIS compliance? No. This slide is showing kind of exactly where that line sits, because understanding this boundary and how you scope your compliance obligations correctly and how you avoid paying to sort of resolve problems that your CSP has already solved. So if you look at the control layers from the bottom of the stack up, physical and data security, that's Microsoft's. You're never going to badge into an Azure government data center, and you don't really need to. So FedRAMP has already validated those controls for you. The hypervisor and host infrastructure, again, that's Microsoft's. Network security and encryption at the platform layer, mostly that's Microsoft, but with configuration responsibilities share at your tenant boundary. And then the line crosses, so identity and access management, that's going to be yours. Microsoft gives you Entra ID, but you decide who gets access and with what authentication strength, under what conditional access policies. Endpoint and device security, that's also yours. The platform can't really control whether a detective's laptop is encrypted and compliant. Application and data control, that's also yours. Data classification, DLP, how CJI is labeled and handled inside your tenant. And then personnel and policy compliance, that is entirely yours. So all the screening, training, policy libraries, that's essentially going to be the human layer. It's expected that that is going to be on the responsibility of the agency. And so the key takeaway box at the bottom, in my opinion, says it pretty cleanly, that the FedRAMP CSP covers the physical, infrastructure, and network layer CJIS controls. And the agency owns the identity, endpoint, data, and personnel. And this is all relevant to the overall M365 Azure infrastructure piece, and not necessarily maybe some on-prem assets that you have within your environment. Okay, so now we get practical. Every organization watching this sort of falls into two camps, and this slide hopefully gives you sort of a playbook. So on the left side, you have an existing 595 program, and you're pivoting to version 6. And on the right side, you're building CJIS compliance from scratch. So let me take them sort of in turn here. So that first pivot path, your first step there is going to be identifying your stakeholders in governance. So this is going to involve assembling the compliance working group, your CSA liaison, IT and security leads, legal counsel, third-party vendors in your CJI ecosystem, and open lines with your audit agency early. So definitely get engaged early on in the process, and this is going to be enormously beneficial to you. The agencies that have the smoothest audits are the ones whose auditors weren't hearing from them for the first time when the audit got scheduled. Step 2, and this is probably, the methodology heart of the pivot, is build your system security plan using Delta first approach. So catalog every control implementation you've documented under 595 and mark each one probably one of 3 ways: existing, meaning it carries forward unchanged; modified, so these are going to be like version 6.0 that change the requirements and your implementation probably needs updating; or new, so version 6.0 introduce something that you've never had to address before. And that delta analysis is going to become your entire roadmap. So for each item that you've identified, you want to craft the implementation statement and then correlate the evidence. And the beauty of a Delta first approach is that it really kind of protects your prior investment. You're not rewriting your program, you're sort of just upgrading it. Step 3, address the deltas sequentially by priority. So P1 first, followed by P2, 3, 4. exactly per the priority system we covered in slide 7. So the phased approach reduces risk and means that you achieve incremental audit readiness as you go, rather than being non-compliant everywhere until you're compliant everywhere, which is stressful and a giant migraine. Step 4, validate and schedule your audit. So run an internal gap review before your auditing agency shows up. You want to unearth those problems before they're unearthed for you. Confirm that the SSP is complete, your evidence is organized and retrievable, and then all stakeholders are aligned on remediation timelines for anything sort of still open. From the from scratch path, your different starting point and it is a little bit different here. So you need to actually define what your CJI boundary is. So before a single control gets selected, identify every system, application, user, and data flow that touches CJI. I cannot overstate how much this step determines everything downstream. So over scoping the boundary, you are going to pay to apply controls where they're not required. If you underscope it, you're going to create audit findings and legal exposure. So a well-drawn boundary is the cheapest risk reduction available in this entire process. Step 2, so selecting and assigning controls. So you're going to map the applicable version 6.0 controls to your environment, assigning each one to a named owner, or maybe that's an individual or a team, and then documenting the implementation approach. Leverage the NIST 853 mappings where they exist. And if your organization has any federal compliance muscle memory at all, those mappings let you sort of reuse it. Step 3, build your SSP from the ground up. Here's the standard that I would probably hold you to. Your implementation statements should document how your organization satisfies each requirement, not merely asserting that it does. So we enforce MFA is sort of just an assertion. Remote access to CJI requires phishing-resistant MFA enforced via conditional access policy, evidence at exhibit ABCD. That's an actual implementation statement. It's not leaving any auditors sort of wondering exactly how this control is actually implemented. You are summarizing it in a concise way as it relates to that particular control. And then step 4, establish ongoing compliance operations. So compliance isn't a project that ends really, it's an operating capability. Continuous monitoring, annual reviews, personnel screening cycles, awareness training, and a designated CJIS compliance owner who keeps the program current as the policy evolves. So build the operations or watch the program sort of decay the day the project team disbands is really going to be your two choices there. On to slide 14. So which pathway is going to be right for you? So if you're a pivot candidate, that means you have an active CJIS program that's built on 595 that you've completed or maybe even partially completed. You have an SSP, your auditing agency is actively transitioning to version 6 review standards. Your real need is identifying and closing specific control gaps rather than just rebuilding. You want to protect the audit documentation investment that you've already made. So definitely leverage work that you've done before. You really don't need to reinvent the wheel here. And if that's you, then that Delta first approach that we just sort of walked through really preserves years of prior work. If you're a from scratch candidate, your agency is newly subject to CJIS. Maybe a new data sharing agreement or a new system was brought into scope, and no prior SSP or formal documentation exists. You're onboarding a new cloud or technology environment that touches CJI. A prior compliance effort was abandoned or maybe has decayed to the point where it's no longer a viable baseline. Or you simply just want a clean version 6 native program without any legacy debt. That's a perfectly fine approach too. You just need to be intentional about what your approach is.
I will add into this may be a great option. What we have seen from some scenarios and some organizations is Either you may have had a mix of resources that were both law enforcement and then what I will say are, civilian resources that are in the same tenant. We're finding many organizations are now segmenting that. This is a great way to help you achieve that. Other ones might be, organizations where maybe like in a university level or in higher education institutions, campus plus police was part of a main tenant, which included students, faculty, and a number of other people. We're finding now that they're making the move to segment out campus police into a separate environment to making sure that they've got a good, clean boundary to be able to support these compliance requirements. And again,
Yep.
for those, a from scratch type of scenario that AJ is talking about here is a perfect way to help fix that and address those scenarios.
Yep. And so let's also now talk about the unified planner approach to CJIS, just on the next slide. So far we've covered what changed and what your obligations are. I want to kind of talk to you about how Planet sort of delivers on this and the three phases on these slides, which are going to kind of touch on this thesis. So rapid deployment, tightly scoped CGI boundary and Microsoft native tooling. So remember when I said that your CGI boundary kind of determines everything downstream? Here is Planet's architecture answer to that problem. It's sort of built on Azure Virtual Desktop. So if you look at the diagram on the right, inside your boundary, you have a GCC moderate to high or Azure government environment, and there's AVD session host and the CGI data. Outside of that boundary are the user devices. That placement is the entire strategy, and the 4 points on the left explain why that works. So boundary isolation. AVD sessions run entirely in Azure. And so when an analyst works with CJI through an AVD session, the data never actually leaves that cloud area, just depending on what sort of restrictions that you have in place, right? So what travels to their device is encrypted pixels. It's essentially a video stream of the session. The CJI itself never actually touches the local machine hosting that AVD. Rapid stand-up. And because Plant has done this repeatedly, we've sort of built a pre-configured deployment accelerator. So there are hardened images, baseline policies, CJIS mapped configurations. We can actually stand up a CJIS scoped AVD environment really in weeks, not months. And so for agencies staring down the priority deadlines that we discussed, that velocity very much matters. Zero local data, so no data rests on the endpoint. And notice what that does to your compliance posture. The CJIS media protection and data at rest encryption requirements for endpoints are satisfied sort of by design and not by policy enforcement on hundreds of devices. So you're not managing the risk, you've sort of architected that risk out. And then centralized control. So every session is logged, monitored, and governed from Azure. When the auditor asks, show me who accessed CJI, when, and from where, well, that's just a simple query, and it doesn't have to become this whole forensic project to get to.
One of the other things I'll mention here and just to highlight too is while we talked about AVDs and well, that's a central part of it, the architecture does have a flexible aspect to making sure that we can account for physical devices as well. We know that we have to be able to account for some of those, whether or not it's, a tough book in a police cruiser or if it's, a mobile device that maybe an investigator needs to have in their hand. Those are designed so that we can include that into that architecture and still be able to extend that security boundary to those devices as well. So
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's I think a really critical point, Scott, because it should be stated that the goal doesn't necessarily have to be eliminate all of on-prem. The goal can also be reduce the on-prem as much as possible, because that is still going to pay dividends from a compliance perspective. Okay, let's move on to the Microsoft tooling stack. Okay, so you see a bunch of tools sort of on the screen right now. This tool set here is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Every one of these are mapped to specific CJIS version 6 control requirements. So I just want to kind of give you a 1-minute version of each and sort of what it buys you in terms of like CJIS compliance. So your Microsoft Entra ID, this is your identity backbone. Remember that identity is the single biggest version 6 change. So MFA enforcement, including phishing resistant methods that the version 6.0 demands, privileged identity management, so admin rights are granted just in time rather than standing there just forever. Conditional access policies that evaluate every sign-in against device, location, and risk. And together, that's your zero trust identity baseline, and directly answers the version 6.0 MFA mandate. Microsoft Intune handles the endpoint layer, so device compliance policies that gate access on device health, app protection and MAM for mobile scenarios, BitLocker encryption enforcement, remote wipe and lock when a device goes missing, which in law enforcement field operations is a win and not if sometimes. Microsoft Sentinel is the SIEM, and this is your audit and incident response engine. It aggregates audit logs across the entire environment, which is going to provide real-time alerting, automating incident response playbooks. And then this is actually a Planet differentiator. We employ CJIS map detection rules. So the analytic rules are aligned to policy areas that your auditor will ask about. So when version 6.0 says tighter incident response timelines, Sentinel is going to be how you meet those. Azure Firewall covers network boundary control. So east and west traffic inspection inside the environment, forced tunneling and NSGs. This is how the network boundary around your CJI enclave gets enforced in practice, not just drawn on a diagram. And then lastly, the Microsoft Defender Suite kind of rounds it all out. So endpoint detection and response, vulnerability management, cloud security posture management, and then email and identity protection. The sentence at the bottom of the slide is sort of an important one. Planet doesn't just license these tools for you. We configure and operationalize them in your tenant, so, mapped directly to those version 6.0 control requirements. Plenty of agencies own this stack today and are still non-compliant, and this is because maybe the tool hasn't been configured to the policy. That value is actually in the mapping.
There was a question too about, will Sentinel work across on-prem servers as well? The answer is yes, it can be configured to that. The only caveat that I would put in that, when you're thinking specifically about CJIS, you want to be very cautious around where does that extend your CJIS security boundary from that perspective. So technically, absolutely. The caveat would be just kind of think about where does that security boundary impact bring that, as you start extending your on-prem servers into that as well.
So if I could conclude the Planet sort of end-to-end CJIS delivery model here, here's how it all kind of comes together as an engagement. It's sort of 5 phases end to end. So that first phase, assess. So the current state gap analysis against the version 6.0, data flow and boundary scoping, and a CSP contract view. Because as we covered, your cloud contracts and security addendum are now formal compliance artifacts. Phase 2, design, the GCC moderate to high or Azure government architecture, the AVD boundary design that we just walked through, and then the mapping of the CJIS controls to the technical controls that will satisfy them. And this is where the compliance requirements and the engineering reality sort of get reconciled on paper, where changes are cheap. Phase 3, build, so tenant deployment and hardening, configuration of Entra ID, Intune, Sentinel, Azure Firewall, and Defender per the design, integration and testing. And this is the accelerated piece. The deployment accelerators from slide 15, or it might have been 16, live here. Phase 4, document. And I'd argue this phase is where engagements with other partners most often fall short. We produce a system security plan. We support the CJIS security addendum process, and we build out the policy library and data flow diagrams. And in an audit, the documentation is the compliance, and an undocumented control might as well not exist. Lastly, phase 5, sustain. So ongoing monitoring and alerting, a compliance review cadence, and an audit support with prepared evidence packs. This maps directly to ongoing compliance operation steps from the from-scratch pathway, because the policy will keep evolving, your environment will keep changing, and the program has to sort of keep up the pace with both. And so the point of showing you all five, you can engage Planet for any phase, but the phases are designed sort of as a continuum. The boundary we scope in assess phase is the boundary we document in phase 4 and defend in phase 5. So with all that being said, Scott, unless you have something else to add to that, I believe we have some frequently asked questions on the next slide. So the first one, does Azure Government or GCC Moderate High make us automatically CJIS compliant? So no, it doesn't. And if you've been with us since the shared responsibility slide, you should know why at this point. It significantly reduces your burden by satisfying the infrastructure level controls, but you still retain the responsibility for identity, endpoint, data classification, personnel, and policy. The platform itself is the foundation. It's not the whole program. When does version 6.0 go into effect, and are there grace periods? So FBI CSA auditors are actively assessing against the version 6 requirements today. So it's recommended that you treat full compliance as the current expectation and not a future one. The structure you have is the priority system. So the things that we were talking about, existing and P1 through P4 controls, everything through phase 4 has to be implemented by October 1st, 2027. And that's not a grace period. It is a phased mandate with a hard end date. What is the CJIS Security Addendum and who needs to align with it? It is a legally binding agreement between a criminal justice agency and any private entity granted access to CJI. Under version 6.0, it's required for all applicable contracts. So just some practical homework for y'all. Inventory every vendor relationship that touches CJI and confirm an executed addendum exists for each one of those. The gaps you find are just the findings that you prevented. Can we use M365 commercial for CJI workloads? This is going to be very state dependent. It's going to be context dependent because as we've been mentioning, there are certain states, Texas, for example, that dictates that a FedRAMP authorized product is used. Maybe not every state has that requirement, but there are still considerations if you choose to move to a commercial, just due to the personnel screening requirements from the CSP personnel, et cetera. Key encryption management, things like that. Is there anyone else who has a question at all that they'd like to ask in the chat or just directly?
Feel free to come off mute or you can post it in the chat. We will send out a copy of the slides and we will make the video recording available for folks. So yes, absolutely. So.
Okay. Well, I don't have anything else.
I want to thank you, AJ. I appreciate your time today. This was very helpful. I found this was very informative. So if you have questions or want to continue the conversation or even want to evaluate what does that mean for us to be able to get to a more CJIS compliant environment, please feel free to reach out. You can reach out to your account executive from Planet, or if you do not know, just go ahead and grab us at our website, go-planet.com/contact, request an assessment, and we'll reach out to you fairly quickly here. So again, thank you guys for your time. We appreciate it, and we wish everyone a great day.